Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could be here today. This is going to be a fun program and lots of interesting information about the women and their role in the American Revolution. It's titled Remember the Ladies, Women of the American Revolution. And our speaker today is Johnny Kinsman. And speaker probably doesn't do it justice. Johnny is an actor and a storyteller and brings all of this to life. So we would just ask that you please silence or mute your cell phones for the program, and I will turn it over to you, Johnny. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for having me back. I really love appearing here, so I'm grateful for the invitation all the time. Just by way of introduction, Sarah was saying I am an actor. I was trained in the theater from a very young age, and the reason that is important is because I found throughout my life, and even continuing through my life, the idea of a strong, competent, equal female leader is not one that is foreign to me. As a student, as a son, as an actor with directors, as a collaborator, as an employee, as every facet of my life, I have been fortunate enough to know very capable, intelligent leaders that also happen to be women. And the reason I bring that up is because I didn't realize that was a unique thing. A lot of men today even do not feel comfortable with the idea of an equal female or a leader, in a woman. And they certainly did not believe that in the 18th century. So I have loved researching for this talk and giving this talk. Now, growing up as an actor, this pursuit brought me to New York City, brought me to Los Angeles, brought me back home to Boston, and in that role, I found myself washed upon the shores of Boston Duck Tours many, many years ago, and I got a job as a tour guide where my love of history combined with my ability to speak to people. And so I was able to learn, and I was forced to learn, really, all about facets of the American Revolution that I had never even heard of prior to being handed that manual. And so all these years later, my job now is to hire and train the tour guides that give the tours, as well as fact check, verify, and research the talking points for the tours. And so that is how I found myself broaching this topic. So I give this talk not only to celebrate the women of the American Revolution and prior and since, but also to show how that old, flawed brand of proud male thinking really came back to kick them right in their short woolen pants. So, with all of that said, let's jump in. This is a woman named Nanyehay. Nanyehay was a Cherokee warrior and a diplomat born in 1738, and she rose to a place of esteem within her Cherokee nation through valor on the battlefield and wisdom off the battlefield. Throughout the American Revolution, Nanyehay counseled compromise between the American settlers, while other Cherokee leaders counseled war. During the 1781 negotiations that followed a series of attacks by American settlers on Cherokee towns, Nanyehay pleaded for peace between the two societies. When the terms of the treaty were agreed to, Nanyehay instructed the eventual Tennessee governor named John Sevier to take them back to the women of his tribe for ratification. For she said, "The women must hear our words." Sevier was dumbstruck. In his world, women played no role in diplomatic affairs, and Nanyehay was equally appalled. How could a treaty be signed if the women of Sevier's world did not give their consent? And this mutual exasperation between a man entrusted with power and a woman burdened by logic, it sets the tone very nicely for the exploration of the topic at hand. Even older than this nation is the flawed adage that behind every great man is a great woman. But if the origin story of the United States proves anything, it's that our success has come not from great women behind men, but beside them. And so this talk is entitled, Remember the Ladies, Women of the American Revolution. So in the simplest of terms, the American Revolution was sparked by people annoying each other to death. We used to be part of England. England needed money. They tried to get money from us. We had a tantrum. They sent soldiers. We didn't like the soldiers being here, so we had a bigger tantrum. They sent more soldiers. Things went on and on and on. Then there was violence, and there was no turning back. And among the grievances voiced in this cause was the lack of representation in the British Parliament. If we were going to be taxed as part of the empire, then we should have some say in what that revenue was used for. And one of the rallying cries of the era was, taxation without representation is tyranny. That was said, anyone know who said that? The guy's name is James Otis, and he is buried in the Granary Burial Ground on the Boston Duck Tour route, right on Tremont Street in Boston. Let me introduce you to his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, the most prominent female propagandist for the Patriot cause was Mercy Otis Warren. In the 1770s, play acting, as they called it, was not permitted in Boston. In fact, Mrs. Warren never saw a stage production in her life. But she read many, many plays, and she was an admirer of the French playwright Molière. And she wrote topical plays in Revolution-era Boston in Molière's same style. So her plays include The Adulateur, The Defeat, The Blockheads, and The Motley Assembly. And in all of these pieces, easily recognizable loyalists and British officials appear as unflattering caricatures which stung the loyalists and delighted the patriots. And more important than the artistic talent exhibited in her satire, her true gift was in capturing the revolutionary zeitgeist of her surroundings and shaping the chaos into words that could steer the frustration of our burgeoning nation into words that could spark outrage, expose injustice, and inspire courage and grim resolve. She says, America stands armed with resolution and virtue, but she still recoils at the idea of drawing the sword against the nation from whence she derived her origin. Yet Britain, like an unnatural parent, is ready to plunge her dagger into the bosom of her affectionate offspring. She corresponded with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, as well as her propagandist peer group in Boston, including Samuel Adams, and she was a great friend and confidant to Abigail Adams and her husband, John Adams, who said, Mrs. Warren had a share, and no small one neither, in the conduct of the American affairs. Now, the autumn of 1774 found the residents of Massachusetts Bay Colony on edge. Revolution was no longer unthinkable. Tensions had been rising since the Boston Tea Party the year before, and Parliament enacted a series of punitive measures closing the port of Boston, which tanked our economy, forbidding town meetings, depriving the colonists of any say in the appointment of judges, and stripping the people of Massachusetts of other rights they had long enjoyed. And in September of 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. It's worth noting this in itself was an act of treason against these measures of the British government. Congress laid out their grievances with Parliament, and they agreed not to import any products from Britain until the offensive measures were repealed. They also, separately, petitioned King George III directly. It was not the Crown, but the Parliament that was oppressing them, and they wished to remain loyal subjects. The Congress even closed its message with a toast, "To His Majesty King George III, may the sword of the parent never be stained with the blood of his children." And then they waited. News traveled very slowly across the Atlantic Ocean. Sometimes it took months. In this case, 3 months passed before they received a response. And on February 1st, 1775, a ship arrived in Marblehead Harbor carrying a copy of the King's November 30th address to the Parliament. The King had rejected the colonists' appeal and reaffirmed his support for Parliament and all its acts. "You may depend," he told Parliament, "upon my firm and steadfast resolution to withstand every attempt to weaken or impair the supreme authority of this legislature." That's my King George III. Thank you. No, thank you. Goosebumps. So, it's a mess. And this is a young Abigail Adams, and she writes in February of 1775, "The die is cast. Infatuated Britain, poor, distressed America. Heaven only knows what is next to take place, but it seems to me the sword is now our only, yet dreadful alternative, and the fate of Rome will be renewed in Britain. A people may let a king fall, yet still remain a people, but if a king lets his people slip from him, he is no longer a king." Now, 2 months later, General Gage, commander of the British forces in Boston, hatched a plan to recapture all of the weapons and gunpowder that the Bostonians had been openly stealing from under the noses of the British sentries, making the Redcoats a laughingstock, not only in Boston, but all the way back in England. And Thomas Gage had many problems, but one of the most insurmountable was his American-born wife, Margaret Kemble. As the tension mounted and her husband attempted to keep the peace and save face at the same time, Margaret confided in a letter to a friend that her loyalties were split between her love of husband and country and the rest of her family. And in this letter, she quotes a passage from a Shakespeare play called King John. Here's an excerpt. "The suns o'ercast with blood, fair day, adieu. Which is the side that I must go withal? I am with both. Each army hath a hand, and in their rage, I, having hold of both, they whirl asunder and dismember me. Whoever wins on this side shall I lose. Assured loss before the match be played." So, General Gage's plan was to send about 700 soldiers in the cover of darkness to the town of Concord, Massachusetts, because the British spies had successfully identified this as the town in which all of these arms were being stored. Gage's patriot foil in Boston at the time was a doctor named Joseph Warren, who was basically the quarterback of the rebel cause on the ground in Boston, and he had spies of his own. And no sooner had Gage given the secret order for the troops to be deployed, but the officer who received the order was confronted by a man on Boston Common, walking the other direction, who said, "You've missed your mark." Meaning, we know the plan and the plan is foiled. The officer immediately went back to Gage and explained this, and Gage's face went white. He said that he had told one person only about this plan. Was it his wife, Margaret Kemble? Had she tipped his hand to Dr. Joseph Warren, who in turn sent William Dawes and Paul Revere on the famous midnight ride? We don't know. We still don't know, but it falls in the category of, if it's not true, it should be true, because it's such a great story. Historians speculate yes and no, and they both make really convincing arguments, but whether or not she was the one who tipped Gage's hand that night, you have to wonder how much of his reluctance to unleash military violence and chaos in Boston for all of that time had to do with trying to appease his cherished wife. So after the midnight ride came Lexington and Concord. And after Lexington and Concord, immediately came the siege of Boston, which went on for 2 months. And the siege of Boston culminated in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And as the Battle of Bunker Hill unfolded in Boston, the windows rattled and the ground shook from the cannon fire all the way in Braintree, Massachusetts, where Abigail Adams and her family were awoken by this noise. And Abigail Adams brought her 7-year-old son, John Quincy Adams, up to the top of nearby Penn's Hill to watch the battle from afar. John Quincy later wrote, "I saw with my own eyes those fires and heard Britannia's thunders in the battle of Bunker's Hill and witnessed the tears of my mother and mingled with them my own." In this celebration of the ladies, I am reluctant to bring up John Quincy Adams and quote him, but in this context, I quote him not as the man who would be president, but as the child, the 7-year-old child who was woken up by cannon fire, didn't know what was going on, and as the mother that decided to take him to that hill to show him exactly what was on the line in this endeavor in which his father was involved and all of their friends. Dr. Joseph Warren, this quarterback on the ground, he was at Bunker's Hill. He was the family physician of the Adams family, and he actually saved John Quincy's finger from having to be cut off after a bad infection. I mean, this was brother against brother, friend against friend, and these two are standing there watching it. So, things are an absolute disaster. Mercy Otis Warren, once again, "I hinted that the sword was half drawn from the scabbard. Since that, it has been unsheathed. Almost every tongue is calling on the justice of heaven to punish the disturbers of the peace, liberty, and happiness of their country." Now, on the subject of shifting loyalty, many women who started the conflict as loyalists to the mother country found themselves switching allegiances to the patriot side because of the treatment they endured at the hands of the British Redcoats. And please, pardon my candor, but among the hardships women were forced to bear was the ever-constant and often realized threat of sexual violence. One account says, "On their march toward Philadelphia through New Jersey, it was reported that they, to the disgrace of a civilized nation, ravish the fair sex. They play the very devil with the girls and even old women to satisfy their libidinous appetites." A mother visiting her daughter in British-occupied New York City reported that the family's politics were changing. She said, "The sentiments of a great number have undergone a thorough change since they have been with the British Army, and as they have many opportunities of seeing flagrant acts of injustice and cruelty of which they could not have believed their friends capable." So again, it's one thing to speak in grand political terms and to think of nations, but when horror like that visits a family personally, suddenly you go, what do I have to do to get rid of these people? And it's very easy to see how the sands of loyalty started shifting. Now, the political turmoil developing into all-out war spurred the ladies of the colony to action in the form of the homespun movement. Women understood the political uses of spinning long before the American Revolution, and in 1748, 300 young female spinsters, as they called themselves, in Boston formed the Boston Society for the Promoting of Industry and Frugality. Very Bostonian. They hosted an event on Boston Common where they brought their spinning wheels onto the common and spun flax for the entire day, an occasion noteworthy enough to be mentioned in British Parliament all the way across the sea. Now, when the Stamp Act crisis arose in 1765, patriot men began referring to themselves as sons of liberty, and women referred to themselves as daughters of liberty. Cloth was England's major industry. And so the boycott of textiles was a very effective economic weapon that could be turned on the mother country. A poem written on the topic made the popularity of this effort grow throughout the colonies. Here's an excerpt. "First, then, throw aside your high top-knots of pride, wear none but your own country linen. Of economy boast, let your pride be the most, to show clothes of your own make and spinning. These do without fear, and to all you'll appear fair, charming, true, lovely, and clever. Though the times remain darkish, young men may be sparkish and love you much stronger than ever. So, next we have something called the Townsend Duties, 1767. These were an attempt to raise money for England without the consent of the colonies, and they placed import taxes on lead, paint, glass, paper, and tea. Bum, bum, bum. The Townsend Acts eventually were repealed for all things except tea. Bum, bum, bum. Tea. Tea became a symbol of Parliament's right to levy taxes, and so tea became a symbol for Americans as well. Refusing to drink tea became mandatory for all true patriots. And since women bore the responsibility for putting food and drink on the table, the tea boycott became a women's cause. In North Carolina, a convention of ladies vowed to give up the pernicious custom of drinking tea, and also not to promote the wear of any manufacture from England until such time as all the acts which tend to enslave this our native country shall be repealed. Again, Mercy Otis Warren, be it known unto Britain, even American daughters are politicians and patriots, and we will aid the good work. On the subject of rising to the occasion, a well-to-do lady wrote a letter to a British officer, and here is an excerpt of that. I will tell you what I have done. My only brother I have sent to the army camp with my prayers. And had I 20 sons and brothers, they should go. I have retrenched every superfluous expense in my table and family. Tea I have not drunk since last Christmas, nor bought a new cap or gown since your defeat at Lexington. And what I never did before, I have learned to knit. And now I am making stockings of American wool. I know this, that as free, I can die but once. These are the sentiments of all my sister Americans. So there's a very old play called Lysistrata. And to summarize very briefly, the men are fighting about nothing, and the women are sick of it, and so they decide to withhold all of their affection, physical and otherwise, from the men until they get it together and create peace, and then love can resume. Well, in the colonies, this was turning into a reverse Lysistrata, because in New Jersey, it was reported that the fair ones in our neighborhood have already entered into a resolve for every mother to disown her son and refuse the caresses of her husband, and every maiden to reject the addresses of her gallant, if these men wavered in their devotion to the cause. Now, these guys are called Hessians. Hessians were a body of professional mercenaries from Germany that were paid to fight on the British side of the war. Not only were they well-armed and well-trained, but they were all the more terrifying in their efficacy on the battlefield because they were not tangled in the complexities of loyalty to the crown or devotion to the American cause. These were hired guns, and they were worth every cent the British spent on them. And yet, even these fearsome warriors saw their numbers depleted by women in the most pacific of ways: love. Flirtatious American girls often went out to watch the troops march by, and their attentions encouraged desertions on both sides. Many a Hessian soldier took a Pennsylvania Dutch wife and traded his bayonet for a plow. Just by existing, the women were depleting the army. It was wonderful. Now, between 1776 and 1779, food shortages caused more than 30 food riots in the American colonies. Angry women accosted merchants who hoarded or overcharged or monopolized coffee, tea, sugar, or flour. As one farmer complained, this is the very same oppression that we complain of Great Britain. Throughout the American colonies, women were trying to manage farms, families and shops while their husbands were away fighting the war, and to make matters worse, they could buy few scarce imports as the war cut off trade with the West Indies. Women organized and participated in most of the food riots. There's a historian named Gary Nash, and he's quoted as saying, "Striding onto the public stage, they became arbiters of what was fair, what was patriotic, and what was necessary to serve the needs of the whole community. Fighting for ethical marketplace conduct was consonant with supporting the glorious cause." So there's a newspaper in 1777 called the Connecticut Courant. Here's their masthead. The East Hartford Food Riot. The Courant described a scene in which a mob of women took 218 pounds of sugar from a merchant that was accused of hoarding it. In Boston, merchants faced 14 food riots after the British evacuated the town in March of 1776. In the summer of 1777, Abigail Adams reported to her husband, John Adams, that there has been much rout and noise in the town for several weeks. So, an otherwise patriotic merchant named Thomas Boylston had tried to drive up the price of coffee and sugar by keeping them off the market. A horde of angry women confronted him, demanding he charge a reasonable price for coffee, and he refused. Wrote Abigail, "A number of females, some say 100, some say more, assembled with a cart and trucks, marched down to the warehouse and demanded the keys, which he refused to deliver. When Boylston stood up to the women," she says, "one of them seized him by his neck and tossed him into the cart. Upon finding no quarter, he delivered the keys when they tipped up the cart and discharged him, then opened the warehouse, hoisted out the coffee themselves, put it into the trucks, and drove off." And Abigail repeated the rumor that the women had spanked Boylston, which is so great because Boylston is John Adams' first cousin once removed. So John Adams, this feisty, malcontent, is hearing that his own cousin was doing all these terrible things and then got spanked in front of a whole bunch of ladies. A large concourse of men stood amazed, silent spectators of the whole transaction, she concluded. I could just hear John Adams' head exploding from wherever he opened this letter. So in Beverly, Beverly Sugar Riot, November 1777, women in Beverly, Massachusetts meted out justice to merchants who refused to accept paper money for sugar. Beverly historian Edwin Stone recorded the incident, which happened on a cold November morning. About 60 women wearing lambskin cloaks with riding hoods marched in order, led by 3 or 4 women, one bearing a musket, and they went down to the wharves with 2 ox carts. The women then went to the distill house where sugar belonging to the late Stephen Cabot had been stored. The foreman locked the gates. The women then called to their aid a reinforcement of men who, with axes, soon demolished the gates. The foreman resisted. So, wrote Stone, his fair assailants, nothing daunted, pressed vigorously to the onset, and seizing him by the hair, which was not of nature's growth, were proceeding to execute summary vengeance when he eluded their grasp by leaving his artificial covering in their hands and fleeing all but scalpless to the counting room, locked himself in for safekeeping. The women forced open the doors and rolled out 2 hogsheads of sugar. They then put them on their carts. Other merchants, seeing the turmoil, started negotiating with the women. In the end, they all agreed to sell their sugar for paper money. Da-da-da. Now, these scenes are just ridiculous. Okay, so there's something else that started to happen in this time was the concept of camp followers. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of camp followers, I want to make clear, during the Civil War, the concept of a camp follower started to have sort of a salacious undertone to it, This was not that at all. These were women and sometimes children, dependents of the soldiers who had to march along with the army. And the two main reasons the women usually followed their husbands into the army was the occupation and or destruction of their homes by the British forces, or they simply wouldn't be able to provide for themselves and their families with the husbands gone. And so they would become camp followers. And so women who traveled with the army had to work to be able to stay. And in exchange for their work, the women received a ration of food. They were also supposed to be paid for the work, but with the soldiers hardly ever getting proper pay, it's unlikely that the women fared any better. Now, these women had to follow many of the same orders and daily routines that the soldiers did, often without whatever small measures of comfort the soldiers were afforded. At Fort Schuyler, for instance, there was little to no room inside the fort for families. And so records indicate that families mostly lived in tents or huts down in a ditch outside of the fort. Now, women who did fall into unsavory practices like prostitution or the unlicensed sale of goods could get punished with the cat o' nine tails, just like the soldiers. With few exceptions, women also had to march along with the soldiers and carry all of their belongings with them, just as the soldiers did. So here's an example of an 18th century, backpack. And this is, the artwork, and I think these shoes were more in the style of what an indigenous woman might be carrying, but the structure is basically the same, and it's not fancy, and it's not comfortable. Imagine marching, 60 miles in a day, carrying your kids and all your stuff. It was just unbelievable what these women endured. Now, once they arrived at the camp, for the privilege of being there, the usual work of women in the army was washing and mending the soldiers' clothes. For every 50 or so soldiers at the fort, one woman would be assigned the work. Can you imagine with the washboard down by a river, washing the clothing of 50 soldiers? And on top of that, they were serving as nurses in the hospitals. Whenever there was a skirmish, they were expected to do it all, as well as cook for the troops too. So, this is a woman named Sarah Osborne. She was the wife of a soldier in the 1st New York Regiment at Yorktown in 1781. And because the soldiers were busy digging trenches and fortifications day and night, they didn't always have time to cook their food, and Sarah and some of the other ladies began cooking for the soldiers. In her pension deposition, Sarah stated that her husband was throwing up entrenchments and that she cooked and carried in beef and bread and coffee to the soldiers in the entrenchment. She further stated on one such trip that she met General George Washington, who asked her if she was not afraid of the cannonballs, and she replied, "No, the bullets will not cheat the gallows." And it would not do for the men to fight and to starve too. So this was no big deal for her. Here's a woman, Mary Ludwig. Mary Ludwig was the daughter of a German settler. In 1775, the Revolutionary War began, and Mary Ludwig Hayes followed her husband to war, a custom in the British Army and, to some extent, the American troops. Following her husband's regiment, she nursed the sick and assisted in cooking and washing. On June 28th, 1778, in Freehold, New Jersey, during the Battle of Monmouth, it was told that Mary trudged back and forth from a nearby spring, bringing water to the soldiers on that hot and smoky battlefield. Welcoming the sight of the sparkling water, the weary soldiers nicknamed her Molly, which was a nickname for Mary, and Pitcher, because of what she was carrying. According to some accounts, on one of her trips from the spring, Molly Pitcher, as she was always called thereafter, saw her husband collapsing next to his cannon, unable to fight. Molly dropped her pitcher and took over his position, and she was seen firing the cannon throughout the dreadful battle until victory was achieved. Her act of heroism on that day earned her a sergeant's commission. On the 4th day of July, 1876, the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the citizens of Carlisle erected a white marble monument inscribed to Molly Pitcher, the heroine of Monmouth, over her grave. A poem by Laura E. Richards commemorating Molly can also be found on her grave. I'm going to read the poem. All day the great guns barked and roared. All day the big balls screeched and soared. All day mid the sweating gunners grim, who toiled in their smoke shroud, dense and dim, sweet Molly labored with courage high, with steady hand and watchful eye, till the day was ours, and the sinking sun looked down on the field of Monmouth won, and Molly standing beside her gun. On the subject of male arrogance. This poor guy, he's just posing for a catalog. Common thinking during the American Revolution conveyed that women were not smart enough to understand the issues relating to war. And as a result, many women could easily overhear classified information by listening to the conversations of the men surrounding them. One woman delighted by this idiotic male behavior was a woman named Anne Bates. Anne Bates was a Philadelphia schoolteacher with loyalist sympathies, and she was one of the most successful British spies of the war. Her espionage began in 1778, shortly after she accompanied her husband, a British soldier and gunsmith, to his post in New York. She posed as a peddler and passed in and out of the American camp with a supply of rhubarb, thread, needles, combs, knives, and as she reported, when she was later applying for a British pension, she would hide her little stock of, humble wares all in different quarters of the camp, and then sell a little and listen, and sell a little and listen, and then go back to the British side. She said, I had the opportunity of going through their whole army, remarking at the same time the strength and situation of each brigade and the number of cannon with their situation and weight of ball each cannon was charged with. She also, here's a letter from one British officer to another British officer, and it's hard to make out, but it is telling of her glory and her success in this endeavor. And she also taught other spies how to locate safe houses as they made their way back to British-held territory. Now, the Patriots became suspicious of her a few times, and on one occasion, Bates was arrested, searched, imprisoned, but eventually released because no one thought she could possibly be a spy. She was a woman. Yeah. She caused substantial damage to the revolutionary cause and was well rewarded by the British for her efforts. So that is, an American working for the Brits. Here is a Brit working for the Americans. This is a woman named Esther de Bert Reed. The text behind her is entitled, as you see, The Sentiments of an American Woman. And it's basically an essay that was printed on this, piece of paper, the size of which is known as a broadside. It was a great big thing. And it was published all throughout the colonies, and it was, encouraging women to get involved in the patriot cause, for their very all was at stake. And here's one excerpt from it. So she's, in this piece, she is likening their plight to that of, women of antiquity who helped with those war efforts. And she says, she's casting her mind back to the female heroism and drawing this parallel. She says, so many famous sieges where the women have been seen forgetting the weakness of their sex, building new walls, digging trenches with their feeble hands, furnishing arms to their defenders, they themselves darting the missile weapons on the enemy, resigning the ornaments of their apparel and their fortune to fill the public treasury and to hasten the deliverance of their country, burying themselves under its ruins, throwing themselves into the flames rather than submit to the disgrace of humiliation before a proud enemy. So she could write. And she could organize people, too. In the Revolution, she helped organize the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia, which raised a significant amount of money. And the group then used the funds to purchase linen and sew clothing for the American troops. Reed also had each volunteer seamstress, this is a close-up of her face, each volunteer seamstress, whether married or unmarried, sew her name into the clothing she made to humanize the war effort for these soldiers receiving the goods. Here's an example of a shirt they might have worn. More than 2,200 shirts for the soldiers were created from the funds and the labor of these women. For Reed's efforts in support of the American cause, she was recognized as a daughter of liberty. Now, this woman's a pistol. Sarah Bradley Fulton was born on December 24th, 1740, in Dorchester, Massachusetts. In 1762, she married John Fulton, and they moved to Medford, Massachusetts. Now, earlier in this talk, I showed you old Boston. It was a peninsula. There was only one way off. And during the siege of Boston, the British were trapped on that peninsula, and all of the Patriot side were sort of trapped off the peninsula, but it created a lot of tension about supplies, in particular, firewood. So as the British were trapped in the siege of Boston, they used their own ships as protection and often rowed across the river to seek fuel and wood in Medford, Mass. Sarah was aware that a shipment of wood meant for the American troops at Cambridge was about to be delivered. So she sent her husband to buy the wood, thinking that the British troops might respect private property that had been purchased. They did not. The British confiscated the wood from Mr. Fulton, but Sarah pursued the British until she reached them. Reportedly, she grabbed the oxen by the horns and turned them around, leading them away, even as the British prepared to shoot her. She simply told them, "Shoot away." And the British, so astonished by her defiance, surrendered the wood to her without any resistance. Now, in March of 76, Major John Brooks of Medford needed an urgent message to be delivered to General George Washington. And so he called upon the Fulton family, and Sarah volunteered to carry the message alone through the enemy lines of Charlestown on the waterfront, and she did so successfully. Message was received. Perhaps her most indelible claim to fame, though, is that she is known as the mother of the Boston Tea Party. Sarah is credited with the idea of disguising the men as indigenous Americans. So they needed disguises because it was treason what they were doing. They would be killed on sight. And so they couldn't quite just be, barefaced doing this act. And so she came up with the idea, let's dress you up like Mohawk natives from the New York tribe. And that way no one will really be able to tell who you are. The irony at this point is that Native American dress was seen as a symbol of freedom. Of course, it didn't result in that in the end, but she organized the men, she helped them get into their disguises, and then afterward, they all reported to her house to get cleaned up and go back to their normal lives in their normal clothes and pretend that they hadn't seen a thing. She died at the age of 95 years old. And she is buried in the Salem Street Cemetery in Medford, Massachusetts. And actually, this first image I showed you, this is a sketch of a statue that they are raising funds to erect in Medford, Massachusetts. So hopefully we'll get to see that in person someday soon. Now, Margaret Catherine Moore Barry. She was the eldest son of 10 children and was an excellent equestrian. Given her familiarity with the wilderness and native trails surrounding her father's property in Roebuck, South Carolina, Kate knew all the shortcuts. Armed with her skills on a horse and on the trail, Kate volunteered as a scout for the Continental Forces. In the winter of 1781, as the Tories, Loyalists, made their way across the Tiger River in advance of the Battle of Cowpens, Kate Barry heard the enemy approaching. She tied her 2-year-old daughter to the bedpost to keep her safe and tore off into the woods to inform her husband, Captain Andrew Barry, and his unit of their impending danger. While being pursued by British forces, Kate swam across the Palisade River on horseback in January, mind you, barely escaping the enemy. Her successful escape set the stage for the turning point of the war in the conquest of South Carolina from the British. The battle was over in less than an hour, and it was a complete victory for the Patriot force. So here is a map of the Battle of Cowpens, and I don't know the particulars of this battle. I'm not a military guy, but let me show you the aftermath of this battle. This red side here, the British redcoats, are surrounded by words like surrender, flight, flight. That's the kind of battle you want. Even I can tell that was a success for the blue guys, right? So, now this is amazing. This story, this is a woman named Mammy Kate. That was the nickname that she went by. Mammy Kate was said to be the biggest, tallest, the most imposing black woman in all of Georgia. A letter from the period described her as a giantess more than 6 feet tall, and a woman who was of pure African blood and declared herself to be the daughter of a great king. Well, Mammy Kate was enslaved by a guy named Stephen Hurd. He was a planter and a soldier who would go on to become the governor of Georgia. On February 14th, 1779, he fought gallantly at the Battle of Kettle Creek, and at some point after that, he was captured by Loyalists. Surprisingly, Mammy Kate's response was to hatch a plan to rescue Hurd before he met the gallows and was hanged as a traitor. Now, some versions, so she rode a horse 50 miles to Augusta to find Hurd. Some versions have Mammy Kate winning the trust of the guards by acting as their laundress for several days or weeks. Another version has her talking her way into the prison only on one occasion, asking for the opportunity to bring this guy some fresh bed linens and some food. Or perhaps she convinced the guards to bring Hurd clean clothing in which to die because he was still a person after all. One way or the other, she was able to enter the prison with a large laundry basket on her head. Hurd's great-granddaughter describes what came next. Grandpapa got into the basket, and the other prisoners packed the clothes around him and helped Aunt Kate put the basket on her head. She then walked boldly out, and Grandpapa made good his escape. This woman is so strong. She's got a full-grown man on her head and is walking out like it's laundry, and it's no big deal. Mammy Kate had left at least one of Hurd's horses, an Arabian named Lightfoot, tied up nearby, as well as another that she'd managed to steal from under the noses of the British stablemen, and Stephen Hurd and Mammy Kate were soon galloping off towards safety. Stephen Hurd gave Mammy Kate her freedom and a tract of land and a place to live near his own home. And she said, the quote was, "Well, you may be freeing me, but I'm not freeing you." She worked for the family for the rest of her life and is now buried with their family plot in their final resting place. So it's a rather odd and heartwarming family story. Now, this is her grave. Mammy Kate, who rescued Stephen Hurd in February on the eve of his execution. It was a very close call for him. Now, this is a girl, a 16-year-old girl. In 1777, a 16-year-old Sybil Ludington learned that the British were planning to attack nearby Danbury, Connecticut, the location of a stockpile of provisions for the Continental Army. Her father, Henry, was a colonel in the militia and command of 400 men. Traveling 40 miles through a driving rainstorm, Ludington mounted her horse, Star, and carrying a stick in her hand, she rode through the dark countryside to muster the militia to stand up to the Redcoats. Now, although the British were successful in their raid on Danbury, the Patriot militiamen, roused by Ludington's alarm, encountered the British at nearby Ridgefield, Connecticut, and were successful in driving them back to Long Island Sound. Here is a statue of Sybil Ludington. You can see her on her horse. Look at her manic expression. It's awesome. Driving the horse with the stick. And this is even cooler. Here's a photo of the commemoration of the statue, the unveiling. And this is the sculptor. Her name is Anna Hyatt Huntington. And I don't know, what struck me is look at her fancy outfit. She looks so genteel, but she couldn't have been wearing that when she was sculpting this enormous horse. Like, it's just awesome. I don't know where I had it in my notes. I don't know where the statue is, but I'll look it up right after the talk and tell you. Revolutionary War. It was funded by the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. Something Huntington. I will also point out this. I give a whole talk on Paul Revere and how heroic Paul Revere is and all of that. Paul Revere rode half the distance, and he got captured. Not the case with Sybil Ludington. And it was a pleasant night when Paul Revere was riding. She rode through a tempest. So, this is amazing too. This woman, well, so this isn't a woman. This is a depiction of the winter of Valley Forge. George Washington wrote at Valley Forge, "To see the men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie upon, without shoes, without a house or hut to cover them until those could be built, and submitting without a murmur, is a proof of patience and obedience, which, in my opinion, can scarcely be paralleled." The Oneida Nation in New York received word of Washington and his starving soldiers at Valley Forge. The Oneidas had experienced a very bountiful harvest and had an excess of corn and other foods that they could share. Oneida Chief Shenandoah sent an expedition of 40 warriors and one woman to accompany them. Her anglicized name was Polly Cooper. The expedition traveled hundreds of miles from central New York through the cold and the snow to deliver 600 baskets of corn to the starving army. Upon seeing the many needs of the army, Polly decided not to accompany the warriors when they departed for their homeland. She remained to help nurse the sick and to pass on her knowledge of medicinal plants and foods. Most importantly, she showed the soldiers and their wives how to make soup from hulled corn that was very nutritious and an essential part of the Oneida diet. Here's a detail of this statue. This is, of course, Washington, Shenandoah, Polly Cooper. She refused to accept any form of payment for the work she had done to aid the Continental Army, stating that it was her duty to help her friends in their time of need. And now for something completely different. I'd like to introduce you to a soldier named Robert Shurtleff. At the age of 21, he enlisted in the Continental Army in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. Being stronger and taller than the average man and with superior physical abilities, Shurtleff was specially picked to be in an elite company of light infantry. And his job was to provide rapid flank coverage for advancing regiments, as well as rear guard and forward reconnaissance duties for units on the move. It was very important work, it was very prestigious work, and it was very dangerous work. Shurtleff fought in several skirmishes, and the discreet nature of the company's assignments often involved spirited, hand-to-hand combat with Tories that had been found and trapped and neutralized. During his first battle in 1782 outside of Tarrytown, New York, Shurtleff was shot twice in the thigh by a musket and sustained a cut on his forehead from a sword. Shurtleff begged his fellow soldiers not to take him to a doctor, but a soldier put him on his horse and took him to a hospital. A doctor treated the head wound, but Shurtleff snuck out of the hospital without receiving any medical attention to the gunshot wounds in his leg. As you can likely guess, the reason that Robert Shurtleff didn't want to be examined by a doctor is because he wasn't a man named Robert Shurtleff at all, but rather a woman named Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson was born in 1760 in Plimpton, Massachusetts. Though her lineage traced all the way back to the Mayflower, her immediate family's poverty made her upbringing a hard one, in which she became an indentured servant that was expected to perform strenuous labor. Having left the field hospital with musket balls still in her leg to avoid detection of her secret, Sampson used a knife and a needle to extract one of the musket balls. The other one was lodged so deeply that it remained in her leg for the rest of her life. Nevertheless, she managed to perform military duties under her assumed persona until the summer of 1783, when she became ill in an epidemic in Philadelphia, and she had a fever, and she fell into the care of Dr. Barnabas Binney. She fell unconscious. Binney removed her clothes to treat her and discovered the cloth she was using to bind her chest. Without revealing his discovery to the Army authorities, he took her to his house, where his wife and daughters and a female nurse nursed her back to health. When Dr. Binney asked Sampson to deliver a note to General Patterson, she correctly assumed that it would reveal her gender. She was honorably discharged at West Point. Patterson gave her a discharge, a note with some words of advice, and enough money to travel home. She was discharged by General Henry Knox in October after a year and a half of service. And then Deborah Sampson retired from the military, started a family, received a modest pension, and eventually traveled the new country on a lecture circuit detailing her experiences in the war for American independence. This is a woman named Lucy Flucker Knox. I just mentioned her husband, Henry Knox. In August of 1773, Lucy Flucker caught the sight of an attractive young man drilling with the Boston Grenadier Corps. The man was Henry Knox, as Lucy discovered after tracking him to his bookstore in Boston's printing district. After that first meeting, the curvaceous brunette fell madly in love with the socially inferior bookseller involved with the Sons of Liberty, who made an utterly unsuitable mate, in the opinion of her father, the Crown-appointed Secretary of Massachusetts. So this is like a Romeo and Juliet. This is a rough situation. Well, Lucy married her Harry anyway. Her parents left town on the day of the wedding, and then they refused to respond to her subsequent letters. She was forced to choose her husband over the rest of her family. When tensions ratcheted up in the earliest stages of the war, Henry and Lucy were forced to escape Boston under the cover of night so Henry could join the rebel army in Cambridge. And Lucy sewed Henry's sword into the lining of her cape as a means of secreting the weapon out through the military blockade. She followed her husband through the army camp of the Revolution, became close friends with the Washingtons, went on to become the foremost social authority of her day. There's a biographer named Nancy Rubin Stewart who described her as kind of a combination of an Oprah and a Rosie O'Donnell and a Margaret Thatcher. If you put all that together, you have Lucy Flucker Knox. But this lady, talk about scandal, Margaret Shippen Arnold, the loyalist woman whose activities were potentially of the greatest value to the British may have been Margaret Shippen Arnold of Pennsylvania. In 1779, she married Patriot general named Benedict Arnold. Within a month of his marriage, General Arnold, who had performed heroically for the Patriots at Ticonderoga, Quebec, Saratoga, had decided to defect to the British. It seems probable that his new wife, who was a devoted loyalist, had a good deal to do with his decision. Now, taking advantage of the upper class convention that discounted the importance of women's political views, Margaret Shippen Arnold had cultivated gentleman friends on both sides of the conflict. She used her influence to secure from Robert Livingston in New York Benedict Arnold's command of West Point. So Benedict Arnold, the plan was for him and this spy master, John Andre, to deliver West Point to the British Army when they arrived. But the plan was foiled at the last minute by the capture of John Andre. Benedict Arnold had to run for his life, leaving Margaret behind to explain the situation to General Washington. Peggy helped him escape, destroyed evidence, and in order to protect herself from questioning and imprisonment, and if found guilty, death by hanging, Peggy threw herself into an hysteric fit. And the episode so convinced Washington and his aide, Alexander Hamilton, that she was completely surprised by her husband's treachery, that Hamilton writes, I wished myself her brother to have a right to become her defender. And look at this. I mean, who could resist this hairdo? I understand his infatuation. It wasn't until several months later that questions began to circulate regarding her role in the affair. And when a compromising letter from John Andre surfaced and Margaret Shippen was finally forced to join her husband in exile. Now, here is a contemporary depiction of her. This is her actual portrait, but this is from a television show called Turn. It's about the revolution. And this is an actress named Ksenia Solo portraying Peggy Shippen. So it's So this event was such a huge scandal that a Philadelphia newspaper declared that evidence should disprove the fallacious and dangerous sentiments so frequently avowed in this city that female opinions are of no consequence in public matters. He quotes, "Behold the consequence." Now, for their own survival, colonial women learned to threaten force and to kill in self-defense. This next woman I want to discuss is Nancy Hart. The most well-known account of Nancy Hart's life begins when 6 British soldiers stopped at her cabin in search of a patriot leader demanding information if he had stopped. Well, he had been there, but she played dumb. Nope, haven't seen him. Well, the soldiers didn't believe her, and so one of the Tories shot and killed Hart's prize turkey, and then ordered her to cook it for them. I guess they had time to kill. Imagine how long it takes on a fireplace. Anyway, so, okay, entering the cabin, they stacked their weapons in a corner and demanded something to drink. So, okay, all right, you want something to drink? So she gets them some water. She gets them some wine, and she's passing through the kitchen, and she's plucking the bird. She's bringing them more wine, and they're getting comfortable, and she's going across the kitchen and passing their weapons out a hole in the wall, and then she's giving them more wine, and then she's plucking the bird, and then she sends her daughter to a hollow tree nearby that has a conch shell you can blow to get the militia to the house, and all of this is going on, and these guys are very comfortable in the fire, and they're drinking, and suddenly they realize what is going on, and she is between them and the remaining weapons in the house, and she grabs one and says, "Do not advance upon me or I will shoot you." And they didn't believe her. Well, they found out she was not kidding. So, because of the daughter rousing the militia, all of a sudden, all these guys show up, including her husband, and he says, "Okay, let's just shoot the rest of them." And she says, No. We're going to hang them. She must have loved that turkey. So, in 1912, workmen grading a railroad near the site of the old Hart cabin unearthed a neat row of 6 skeletons that lay under nearly 3 feet of earth and were estimated to have been buried for at least a century. Now, this is a different sort of heroism. This is a woman named Mary Catherine Goddard. She was born in New London, Connecticut, and was the daughter of a family of printers. Well-educated woman, but as terrible luck would have it, her father passed away. She became a printer's apprentice. Her brother became a printer. Later on, she became a printer in her own right because she had lived through her apprenticeship. Over the next 15 years, she became known as a patriot publisher, and she reported on the British blockade of Boston Harbor. She officially endorsed the homespun movement, and later that year published Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 2 installments. That was instrumental in swaying people's minds toward the cause. Goddard published an early version of the Declaration of Independence in the Maryland Journal a few days after July 4th, 76. 6 months later, Congress asked her to print another one. And this one was more special because it included the names of the signers. Very, very risky, putting your name out there as a traitor to the mother country. The sheer act of publishing the document put Mary at risk of persecution by the British, but she then went one step further. She signed her own name at the bottom of the document. Baltimore, in Maryland, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. She was, in effect, the only woman to sign the Declaration of Independence. This document is sometimes referred to as the Goddard Broadside, and 10 copies of it still exist today. Now, remember earlier I was talking about those German mercenary guys, the Hessians? So this is a map of New Jersey. Hessian mercenaries were occupying the town of Trenton, New Jersey, because Trenton was too small to accommodate the entirety of the Hessian force. A lot of them were in the nearby town of Mount Holly, some 18 miles away, more than a one-day march in the stormy weather of December. But the overall commander of the Hessian forces was Colonel Karl von Donrop. And having come to Mount Holly, he decided to stay and to keep most of his troops with him. Why? Because of an exceedingly beautiful young widow. A fellow officer serving with the colonel wrote, "The colonel, who was exceedingly devoted to the fair sex, had found in his quarters the exceedingly beautiful young widow of a doctor. He wanted to set up his rest quarters in Mount Holly, which, to the misfortune of Colonel Rahl, the commander at Trenton, he was permitted to do. Donrop stayed the night on December 23rd, then another night, and then through Christmas." Well, what follows is one of the most famous events of the entire Revolution. Washington and his troops crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night and attacked the troops at Trenton early the next morning. Donrop was not close enough to offer support, and that lack of support aided Washington and his troops in overcoming the Hessians. Historians have never been successful in identifying the young widow who helped with the cause. Here's another woman named Lydia Dara. She was living in Philadelphia with some of her family. Other members of her family were already sent out to live with other people because the British were just encroaching in every way. And Major John Andre, this spy master, knocked on Dara's door and said, "Move out. You got to get out of the house. We're going to use it for British officers." So she had 2 little kids living with her at the time. She had nowhere else to go. But she knew that Lord Howe, General Howe, was right nearby, so she thought she would go petition for leniency and maybe they could use another house. So she leaves her house. In the street, she runs into her own cousin, who's in a British redcoat uniform. He's an Irish guy, and he's serving in the King's Army. And he goes, "Oh, what are you doing here? What are you doing here?" "Oh, well, they're trying to kick me out of my house. Can you put in a word with Howe? I can't do this." He says, "All right, I'll arrange it. Well, he arranges it so she can stay. But the British officers still have meetings in the house. So she hides in the closet. And these guys are laying out their entire battle plan that's going to happen in a couple of days, and they're moving their little people around the map, and Lord Howe is saying this and that, and John Andre keeps knocking on the door to the bedroom. "Are you awake?" "No, we're asleep." Okay. So this whole thing goes on, and she comes up with an errand to run. She needs a sack of flour, so she asks permission. "Please, may I go get a sack of flour for the household?" "Oh, sure, you silly women. Go ahead, get your flour." Well, she, of course, runs right to the American camp because her own son was at the camp that they were about to attack. And she went to a tavern where she found a Patriot soldier and relayed the information that General Howe was coming out the next morning with 5,000 men, 13 pieces of cannon. He found the information credible. He passed it along. And when the British arrived at this camp, it was obvious that the Americans had been well prepared for the attack and knew when they were coming. Major John Andre was humiliated. He was very angry, and he kept questioning her. "Did you spill the beans with your sack of flour, Aaron?" No. I was asleep. Well, the Quaker housewife had outwitted the British spy master. And the reason I bring up that she was a Quaker is because she was a very religious woman. And when she was later asked how, being a religious woman, she had justified telling a lie. And she replied, "Husband and wife are one, and that one is the husband, and my husband was in bed." Religious technicality. Now, different topic a little bit. This is a statue in the Boston Public Garden of a man named Wendell Phillips. He was an abolitionist in the 1800s, and the only reason I include him is because of the quote above his head. I love this quote. "Whether in chains or in laurels, liberty knows nothing but victories." One of the ironies and the hypocrisies of this entire American Revolution is that these American men were crying for freedom and claiming slavery from the British Empire while actively engaging in real slavery in their own country. And this was pointed out widely at the time. General Washington's, one of his closest aides, the Marquis de Lafayette, was begging him, rethink this issue. Well, change was not to come yet. But a woman named Mum Bet is a little-known national hero and a symbol of courage and spirit to all her strive for freedom. She was born into slavery in 1742. Soon after the Revolutionary War, Bet heard the Massachusetts Constitution read aloud in the Ashleys' home and heard these words from the first article: "All men are born free and equal." Well, Bet recognized the potential legal and moral import of these words and sought out an attorney to sue for her freedom under the newly ratified state constitution. So this lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick from Stockbridge, Mass., pled her case in front of the Court of Common Pleas in Great Barrington, and the jury ruled in her favor, and she became the first African-American woman to be set free under the Massachusetts Constitution. Her case served as a precedent in the state Supreme Court case that brought an end to the practice of slavery in Massachusetts, and as a free woman, Bet took the name Elizabeth Freeman. She died in 1829 and is buried in the Stockbridge Cemetery, and she remains an inspiration to all of us who work for a world in which we are free and safe. Here's a slightly different story in the same theme. This little girl was stolen from Africa when she was 7 years old. She was sick when the journey began. She was even sicker when the journey ended. She arrived in Boston and was purchased by this family named the Wheatley family. And she came in on a ship called the Phyllis. And so her name became Phyllis Wheatley. And as far as people engaged in slavery go, the Wheatleys were, I guess, a little bit progressive because they decided to teach Phyllis to read. They took her in as one of their family. She was still in servitude in their home. This was not completely, without barbs. But they did care for one another, and she proved to be a fast study and a quick student with a thirst for knowledge. And because of her felicity with the pen and her access to high society in the Wheatley home, she found herself in a position to attempt to guide British governance in the American colonies. So there was a new, guy in charge. He was Lord Dartmouth, and Phyllis wrote a poem to him, hoping that he would be more lenient and reasonable with the colonies than his predecessor had been. So here's an excerpt of the poem called "To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth." "Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afrique's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast, steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway?" She's drawing a direct parallel between her experience and the plight of the patriot cause and the call for reason and humanity. So as the events of the global conflict unfolded, Phyllis Wheatley found herself reeling in the confusion of the rapidly shifting political landscape, and once again she picked up the quill because she saw George Washington as a return to normalcy. She didn't have a dog in this fight. She didn't care whether they were called England or America or anything. She just wanted life to go back to normal. So she was championing Washington, and here's an excerpt from a statue to him. This is a statue of her, by the way, on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. It's called the Women's Monument. It's awesome. It's Abigail Adams, Lucy Stone, an abolitionist, and Phyllis Wheatley, and they are all life-size. You can walk right up, sit with them, talk to them, touch them, take pictures. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading. Washington, be thine. This poem so moved the stoic General Washington that he shared it only privately for fear of being accused of the sin of vanity. But then, its eventual publication by political philosopher Thomas Paine brought Wheatley's words to the eyes of the world. Now, the last woman I'd like to discuss, we've touched on before, Abigail Adams. Although her husband, John Adams, could be cranky and ill-tempered, her words, just think how grumpy he would have been without the support of his wife for 54 years, as he called her his Portia. I'll comment on that in a moment. They spent much of their marriage apart due to circumstances and a sense of duty to country, to family. But the passion of their partnership still sizzles from the pages of their letters to one another. And Abigail's writings showcase an intellect that puts her in step with the greatest leaders of our nation, which was a mantle that she wore confidently and casually. Now, Portia, in Shakespeare's canon, is the name of a character who, because she was a woman, could not act as a lawyer to defend her friend in a court of law. The punishment was death, a pound of flesh. It's from The Merchant of Venice. Portia disguises herself as a man, walks in, and not only can, hang with these guys, she defeats them with her legal brilliance by pretending to be a man so that the men will accept her. So the wonderful irony of John Adams, the attorney, calling his much smarter wife, Portia, is not only romantic, but it's really astute. I think it's just such a lovely nickname. He recognizes her brilliance, and she was ahead of her time, and in him recognizing her brilliance, even he was too, even though he was a real grump. Anyway, as the Second Continental Congress was formed, in the debate, they were talking about the Declaration of Independence, Abigail began the arguments in her letters to her husband that the creation of a new form of government was a chance to make the legal status of women equal to that of men. She says, "If we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned women. The world perhaps would laugh at me and accuse me of vanity, but you know I have a mind too enlarged and liberal to disregard the sentiment. I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend." So here is Abigail at the approximate time that she was writing these words. To conclude this whole talk, my hope is that by highlighting some of the contributions of the women in this talk, I've reminded us that just as the uniforms of our brave Minutemen were woven by the women of this new country, the fabric of our nation itself has been woven by subsequent generations of brave women standing beside men, not behind men. And to quote Abigail, "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion." And so anyone who is interested in our collective rich past and a bright future would do well to remember the ladies. Thank you. So I will take questions if you have any questions. Yes, sir. I don't know where the portrait is. It might be in the Boston MFA. I can look it up for you. I've got my computer here. But she was not related to Dr. Joseph Warren. But they were friends. So, it took me a while to sort of unsnarl that knot. But no, they were not related. They just happened to have the same name. Here, let me find Mercy Otis Warren. Yeah, there's a detail of her face. Anyone else have any questions? No? Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Approximately like Exeter Street. It's a little further removed from the public garden. You'd be better off starting near the Prue or Huntington Ave, where the duck stop is, and then walking toward Com Ave. It's within a block. I think it's between Exeter and Fairfield. It's really neat. I don't know what year they put it there, but it's striking. It could be fairly new because, it doesn't have any sort of patina on it of age, So I don't know where it is, but there's no mistaking it. I mean, when you see it, it's arresting. It's a whole little plaza. So it's 3 women. It's, low granite or marble or something with Wheatley on one side, Lucy Stone on the other, and Abigail Adams. And it's got like inscribed quotes in the stone. It's beautiful. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.